emerging topics in power systems. We have 5 presentations in this session, and the first presentation is Mesogrids for regional power delivery and reliability. It's going to be presented by Roger, President and founder of Rethink Technologies, and each presentation is about 20 minutes and with 5 minutes of Q&A. Roger.
Thank you. I think it's true to say that one of the main objections that ordinary people have to the way the grid works is the presence of overhead power lines. It's virtually impossible to install a new overhead power line in America or Europe because of all the public opposition. I started down this path working on the supergrid problem, and I have an invention, the L-pipe, that's a way to move supergrid capacity lines underground. I realized more recently that supergrids are too big and too long-term. They'll probably never be implemented unless there's a stepping stone kind of project. And I believe the Mesogrid is such a project. As I'm using the term, Mesogrid means the intermediate voltage level at which power is delivered to substations. Between transmission voltage and substation supply voltage is the reading. In the US, I think it's 80 kV to 280 kV is the range of interest. And there's many reasons why undergrounding is important. Lately, fire risk comes up a lot in California. And because that's such a hot button issue, I decided to model the San Francisco Bay Area based on all the fire risk there. I think I covered those points. But here's the key realization I had. Within a metropolitan area, those rights of way are potentially worth a lot of money. And this is sort of a mesogrid refit of a city. Besides being politically popular, it frees up an awful lot of real estate value. And if there's a way to tap into that, there's a way to pay for the system. There's some considerations. In any grid, you have to change voltages at the very least. And in the grid as it is today, transmission is going towards high voltage DC, but we still have AC delivery of power. So there's necessarily a change from DC to AC. I envision a future grid that's all DC, but certainly that's not going to come about in the next 20 years. So what are the stepping stones? Transmission is already going to HVDC, and microgrids are trending towards DC, but that intermediate voltage level is hardly being addressed. And I've come to believe that could be paid for from the value of putting those power lines underground in an urban area. It's true to say that DC-DC converters, if you look at the component cost, should be about 30% less expensive than an equivalent kilowatt capacity DC-AC converter. Now, that's not true of market price because there's not a sufficient market in this voltage range. Now, I'm proposing sort of a replacement for that intermediate voltage stage. And I wanted to give a little thought to what should be the standard voltage. One of the considerations in my mind is if the voltage is kept below about 130 kV, then the mesogrid is voltage compatible with the future superconducting supergrid. Without any voltage conversion equipment, you could directly link the mesogrids. I think all those other things are pretty obvious to you folks. Anyway, for any type of switch, and in that range of, say, around 120 kV, you're going to have series connected switches. If there's silicon, it's going to be 6,000 volts per step. If it's thyristors, it's 8,000. If it's silicon carbide transistors, it's 15,000. So I think it's important to pick a standard voltage which is evenly divisible by many steps. And this little table here compares 126 kV, which is on the right, to 120 kV for voltage steps. I can't read it myself. I think it's 8 to 60 steps. And the reason that could be important is maybe there's a future semiconductor technology that has a sweet spot at a particular voltage that, so you have 12 in a row or whatever. I think it's just reasonable to consider that at this stage because there is no such thing as a mesogrid right now. For this preliminary paper, I started out with a map of the San Francisco Bay Area power grid. And I picked San Francisco for a number of reasons. It certainly is a place that fire risk is on everybody's mind. All you have to do is read the San Francisco Chronicle. There's all kinds of front page stories about it. It's also a place where a lot of thought leaders live and a lot of innovative people, and I consciously thought that would be a good area to focus on. In my map, I had two different kinds of connections, cables at two different ampacities, 285 and 800 amps, and L-pipes. L-pipes are my invention that was aimed at the supergrid. And I did most of my work modeling 800 kV L-pipes, whereas this is a lower voltage, although it's still in the HVDC range, 126 kV, and that implies pretty high ampacity. The L-pipes would, well, for this model, 15,000 amps is what I modeled them for. This is a map of the San Francisco Bay Area, and all of the nodes I picked are pre-existing large substations. And the only part of that that runs off of established rights-of-way is crossing the Golden Gate Bridge. There's multiple ways to do that. But those three ampacities cover all of the substations in the area. And by forming a DC loop around the area, you intrinsically have n-1 redundancy, and when you start putting in additional lines, it gets better. Yeah, I think I already mentioned why I picked Palo Alto and San Francisco Bay. The next map zeroes in on a portion of that previous map and looking at adding in cable connections as well as the L-pipe connection. The large green line is the L-pipe 15,000 amp connection. The heavy black line is 800 amp, and the smaller ones are 285 amp. For reference, the 800 amp connection is 300 megawatts. And it's obvious if you just glance at that map that you could improve redundancy by putting in a few connectors. Since this is all underground, that's way more feasible than putting in an overhead line. So there's some, from the power system point of view, one of the important things the Mesogrid does, it prevents accidental transfers of electricity through a metropolitan region, which basically takes away from transmission capacity within the region. No unscheduled transfers. The other thing is it aggregates all the loads and the generation so that the mesogrid looks like a single source to the surrounding grid. And yet, it connects to major AC power lines coming in from multiple directions. And it would have the effect of stabilizing the surrounding grid. The asynchronous operation that's possible with the VSCs gives you full 4-quadrant control of the power. You can handle reactive power and all the different things that happen in an upset. For me personally, the Mesogrid comes as a breakthrough idea because I realized that the Mesogrid is the logical stepping stone to a future supergrid. The next two pictures show actual power lines in Palo Alto. The first one is, I forgot what they call those, monopoles, I think. It's a lot less intrusive than the pylons, but it's still a behemoth, and I'm sure people don't like the visuals on that. And the next one's a conventional pylon route. The only reason those things are in Palo Alto is that they were there a long time ago. If you tried to install those things today, there'd be amazing opposition. Let's face it takes 15 to 20 years to put in a new power line in America. I say, let's give the public what they want and go underground. And what's holding us up? Let's see. Is it the cost of the cable? Next slide is a quote I got from Southwire. The 285 amp cable, they quote at $20 a foot, and the 800 amp cable at $30 a foot. And guess what? That's around 1/10 of the cost that PG&E is constantly citing of $3 million a mile. And if there's any one thing that needs to change, it's this picture here. I think it's true to say that a gas or oil well can be sunk a mile deep for $500,000. Compared to the technology that's deployed there, we are in the dark ages. I do have inventions in this area to debottleneck this, and I believe it's feasible to cut by a factor of 3 the total cost of installation. Here are some of the advantages for the Mesogrid. Obviously, it improves aesthetics, and that's important because it will bring the politicians along, it'll bring the public along. The public-facing reason for doing it should be about aesthetics and the environment. But it's got goodies for the power systems experts too. It aggregates loads and generation. It prevents flow-through of power, makes it easier to interface with battery backup and solar PV and data centers. Maybe it certainly will reduce harmonics as well, which is relevant sometimes. Now, I intend to keep pursuing this. I've already got co-authors lined up for some other papers. And we're going to pick a particular city to model in more detail, like with Power World software or something like that. I intend to also quantify the value that comes from aggregating loads and generation in an urban area. I think that'll be large. And the effect on the stability of the connected AC grid would be large too. My personal focus is going to be on making the cost of installation of these things cheaper. I'm an inventor. I'm actually a polymer scientist and a chemical engineer, not an electrical engineer. But I have 2 pretty important patents in this field, the L-pipe and the ballistic breaker, both of which are enabling technologies for a future supergrid. One is a pipeline-sized sodium-based conductor that can easily carry 20,000 amps at very high voltage. Of course, that's got to be proven, and I've never managed to get the funding to prove it. And the other is a type of DC circuit breaker. Those are the 2 key things that are needed to enable a supergrid. You got to be able to move it underground, and you got to have less costly DC circuit breakers. And I intend to find some partners working on superconducting supergrid and do some papers about the 126 kV standard linking. If you have a supergrid which only links major metropolitan mesogrids, it's a way more soluble problem. As you probably know, the interface between conventional conductors and superconductors is a very difficult problem. And as you cut down the number of those linkages, the system becomes more reliable. And I'll take your questions now.